Before we dive into this epic Viking tale, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that like button if you enjoy stories of courage, sacrifice, and the brutal realities of the Viking Age. Drop a comment below telling us where in the world you're watching from. We love hearing from our global Viking story community. The morning mist clung to the fjord like the breath of sleeping gods, obscuring the longships that cut through the dark waters with the silence of hunting wolves. Ragnar Bloodaxe stood at the prow of the lead vessel, his weathered hands gripping the carved dragon head as his pale blue eyes surveyed the Saxon settlement ahead. The village of Whitmore lay vulnerable in the early dawn light, its thatched roofs and wooden palisades no match for what was coming. "How many fighting men do you count, Olaf?" Ragnar's voice was barely above a whisper, carried away by the salt wind. Olaf the Wise, his trusted advisor and friend since childhood, squinted through the lifting fog. His greying beard was braided with iron rings that clinked softly as he moved. "No more than a dozen, my Jarl. Most are likely farmers who've never held a sword in true battle. The real warriors are probably with King Ethelred's army, fighting the Danes to the south." Ragnar nodded grimly. At 43 winters, he had led more raids than he could count, but each one still carried the weight of decision. These Saxon villages held families, children, elderly grandparents, people whose only crime was being born on the wrong side of the North Sea. Yet his own people needed food for the coming winter, silver to trade with the merchants from Hedeby, and thralls to work the fields back home in Norway. The chieftain's own children would face starvation if this raid failed. His wife Astrid had died, giving birth to their youngest son 2 winters ago, and now he carried the burden of both father and mother. The harsh realities of leadership meant making choices that haunted his dreams. "Signal the other ships," Ragnar commanded. "We take the village before the sun fully rises. Remember, we need them alive. Dead slaves serve no one." The horn sounded 3 low notes, and 40 Viking warriors began their silent approach to shore. Their mail shirts clinked softly as they moved, leather boots finding purchase on the rocky beach. Each man knew his role. Some would secure the perimeter, others would gather livestock and supplies, while a select few would identify the most valuable captives. In the Saxon village, 13-year-old Edmund was already awake, having risen before dawn to help his father Aldrich tend to their small flock of sheep. The boy had inherited his father's dark hair and serious demeanor, but possessed an intelligence beyond his years. At his side, his 10-year-old sister Gwyneth hummed softly as she scattered grain for the chickens, her golden hair catching the first rays of sunlight. "Father says we might move to Winchester soon," Gwyneth said, her voice filled with the excitement of a child who had never traveled beyond the village boundaries. "He says there are stone buildings there taller than 3 men, and markets with goods from lands across the sea." Edmund smiled at his sister's enthusiasm, though worry gnawed at his stomach. For weeks, travelers had brought news of Viking raids along the coast. Ships with striped sails and dragon prows had been spotted, and entire villages had simply disappeared. The survivors who managed to flee spoke of warriors who appeared like wraiths from the morning mist. "Perhaps we will," Edmund replied, though he knew their father could barely afford to feed them here, let alone pay for passage to Winchester. Aldrich had been a Thane's man once, before a hunting accident left him with a withered arm that could barely hold a sword. Now they survived on their small plot of land and the charity of neighbors. The sound that changed everything was subtle at first, the soft scrape of wood against stone as the longships ran aground. Then came the splash of men dropping into shallow water, followed by the whispered commands in a language that sounded like winter wind through bare trees. Edmund's blood turned to ice. He grabbed Gwyneth's hand and pulled her behind their small wooden dwelling, pressing a finger to his lips. Through a gap in the wattle and daub wall, he could see figures moving through the village like shadows given form. The Vikings had come. Ragnar Bloodaxe moved through Whitmore with the practiced efficiency of a predator. His warriors spread out in predetermined patterns, cutting off escape routes while avoiding unnecessary violence. The goal was control, not slaughter, though they were prepared for both. The first Saxon to spot them was old Henrik the blacksmith, who dropped his hammer with a clang that echoed through the morning air. The sound brought villagers stumbling from their homes, and in moments the peaceful settlement transformed into a scene of controlled chaos. "Please," shouted Aldrich, emerging from his dwelling with his good arm raised in submission. "We have nothing of value. We're simple farmers." Ragnar studied the man with the calculating gaze of someone who had learned to read people's worth in heartbeats. The withered arm told a story of lost battles and broken dreams, but the man's eyes held a dignity that commanded a measure of respect. "Everyone has value," Ragnar replied in heavily accented but understandable Saxon. "The question is what kind?" He gestured to his men, who began herding the villagers toward the center of the settlement. "Where are your children?" The question sent ice through Aldrich's veins. Behind their home, Edmund held Gwyneth so tightly he could feel her small heart hammering against his chest. The boy's mind raced through possibilities. They could try to run for the forest, but the Vikings would surely catch them. They could hide until the raiders left, but what if they burned the village? What if they killed their father? "I said, where are your children?" Ragnar's voice carried the weight of absolute authority. "I can smell the fear of young ones. Bring them out, and no harm will come to any of you." Aldrich's shoulders sagged in defeat. "Edmund, Gwyneth, come out, my children." Slowly, the two children emerged from behind the dwelling, Edmund keeping himself between his sister and the Viking chieftain. Ragnar's experienced eyes immediately assessed them. The boy showed courage despite his obvious terror, while the girl possessed the kind of Nordic features that would fetch a high price in the slave markets of Dublin or Constantinople. "What are your names?" Ragnar asked, his tone gentler now. "I am Edmund, son of Aldrich," the boy replied, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "This is my sister Gwyneth." Ragnar nodded appreciatively. Courage in the young was a rare quality, one that could be shaped and molded. The boy would make an excellent addition to his household, perhaps even trained as a warrior in time. The girl would serve in his hall until she came of age, then could be married to one of his men or traded for alliance. "You will both come with us," Ragnar announced. "Your lives in Norway will be different, but you will live. That is more than many can promise in these times." It was then that Edmund made the desperate plea that would echo through the ages in Viking sagas and Saxon chronicles alike. "Please," the boy said, stepping forward with a bravery that impressed even the hardened raiders, "take me if you must, but leave my sister. She's only a child. Take me alone, and I'll serve you faithfully until my last breath." The offer hung in the morning air, like incense in a Christian church. Around them, the other villagers watched in stunned silence as a 13-year-old boy attempted to negotiate with one of the most feared Viking chieftains of the age. Ragnar studied Edmund with new interest. The boy was offering his own freedom to protect his sister, a gesture of selfless love that reminded the chieftain of his own protective feelings toward his children back in Norway. But Ragnar had not survived 4 decades of warfare by making emotional decisions. "And why?" Ragnar asked slowly. "Would I accept one slave when I could have 2? Edmund's mind raced. He had no wealth to offer, no skills that would make him more valuable than both children combined. All he had was his desperation and love for his sister. "Because," Edmund said, his voice gaining strength, "one willing slave who serves from honor is worth more than 2 who serve from fear. Take my sister, and she will hate you every day until she dies. She will dream of escape, of revenge, of ways to hurt you and your people. But take me willingly, and you will have someone who keeps his word." The logic was sound, Ragnar had to admit. Unwilling slaves required constant watching, while those who accepted their fate could eventually become trusted members of a household. But the girl's value was undeniable. Her beauty and youth made her a valuable commodity in multiple ways. Ragnar was about to respond when Olaf stepped forward. "My Jarl," the older man said quietly, "the boy speaks wisdom beyond his years. But perhaps there is another way to look at this." "Speak," Ragnar commanded. The boy offers himself to save his sister from slavery. Such loyalty, such courage, these are the qualities we value most in our own sons. Perhaps, Olaf paused, choosing his words carefully, perhaps they are too valuable to waste as mere thralls. Ragnar's eyes narrowed as he caught his advisor's meaning. The boy's selfless courage and the girl's beauty could serve purposes beyond simple labor. A boy who would sacrifice himself for family could be molded into a loyal retainer, even a foster son. A girl of such striking appearance could eventually become a valuable marriage alliance. But that would mean raising Saxon children as if they were Norse, a decision that carried its own risks and complications. "You ask me to spare your sister," Ragnar said to Edmund. "But what if I told you there was a way for both of you to not only survive, but to prosper?" Edmund's eyes widened with desperate hope. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Ragnar said, his voice carrying the weight of a decision that would change multiple lives, "that sometimes the gods present us with opportunities disguised as problems. Your courage impresses me, boy. Your sister's beauty could open doors that mere silver cannot. Perhaps you are both too valuable to waste in the slave pens." The chieftain turned to address his men. "Bind them gently. They travel with us not as thralls, but as investments in the future." As Viking hands reached for the children, Edmund felt the world spinning around him. He had tried to save his sister by sacrificing himself, but somehow both their fates had become intertwined with this terrible, magnificent stranger who held their lives in his scarred hands. Gwyneth clutched her brother's hand as they were led toward the longships, their father's anguished cries echoing behind them. Neither child understood that Ragnar's decision to take them both had just set in motion a chain of events that would reshape the political landscape of both Saxon England and Viking Norway. The raid on Whitmore was ending, but their story was just beginning. The longship Seawolf carved through the churning waters of the North Sea like a blade through flesh. Its dragon prow pointed toward the distant shores of Norway. 3 days had passed since the raid on Whitmore, and the 43 captives huddled in the ship's belly had settled into a grim routine of fear and resignation, all except 2. Edmund sat with his back against the oak ribs of the ship, his arm protectively around Gwyneth, who had barely spoken since leaving their homeland. The boy watched Ragnar Bloodaxe with the intensity of a hawk studying its prey, trying to understand the man who held their fate in his battle-scarred hands. The Viking chieftain stood at the steering oar, his iron-grey hair whipping in the salt wind as he guided the ship through waters he had navigated for over 2 decades. There was something almost mystical about the way he read the waves and sky, adjusting course with subtle movements that kept them ahead of the storm clouds gathering on the horizon. "He's not what I expected a Viking to be," Gwyneth whispered to her brother, speaking for the first time since yesterday. Edmund glanced around to ensure none of the Norse warriors were listening. "What do you mean? Father told us stories of Vikings as monsters who eat children and drink blood from human skulls," she said, her voice barely audible above the creak of the ship's timbers. "But he speaks our language. He could have killed everyone in the village, but he didn't. And the way he looks at us sometimes, it's not the look of someone planning cruelty." Edmund had noticed it too. When Ragnar thought no one was watching, his expression would soften as his eyes fell on the Saxon children. There was something almost paternal in his gaze, though Edmund couldn't understand why a man who had just destroyed their lives would show such concern. Olaf the Wise approached their position, moving with the careful gait of someone who had spent decades on rolling ships. The older Viking carried a wooden bowl of fish stew and a piece of hard bread, which he offered to the children without ceremony. "Eat," Olaf commanded in his accented Saxon. "The crossing to Bergen takes 5 more days, and you'll need your strength." Edmund accepted the food, but hesitated before eating. "Why is your chieftain keeping us separate from the other captives?" Olaf studied the boy with pale blue eyes that held the accumulated wisdom of 60 winters. Because you are not the same as the other captives. Your courage changed things, boy. Ragnar sees something in you both, something worth more than the price you would bring at market. I don't understand, Gwyneth said softly. Are we slaves or not? The question made Olaf pause. In truth, the girl had asked something that had been debated quietly among the crew since leaving England. Ragnar had given orders that the children were to be treated with respect, fed well, and kept away from the rougher elements among the captives. But their legal status remained unclear. That, Olaf said carefully, depends on what you make of the opportunity my Jarl has given you. Before either child could ask what he meant, a commotion arose from the other end of the ship. One of the Saxon captives, a young man named Godwin, who had been the village baker, was arguing loudly with his Viking guards. His voice carried across the ship as he gestured angrily at the children. "It's not right," Godwin shouted in broken Norse he had picked up during the voyage. "Those children eat better food while we get scraps. They sleep under furs while we shiver in the cold. What makes them so special?" The complaint resonated with several other captives, who began muttering agreement. Edmund felt a chill that had nothing to do with the ocean spray, as he realized their preferential treatment was creating resentment among their fellow Saxons. Ragnar appeared as if summoned by the disturbance, his presence immediately quieting the unrest. He surveyed the scene with the calculating gaze of a predator, noting the positions of every person involved, the mood of the crew, and the potential for violence. "You question my decisions regarding these children?" Ragnar asked Godwin, his voice carrying the deadly calm that preceded storms. The baker's courage faltered under the chieftain's stare, but desperation drove him to continue. I mean no disrespect, Lord, but we don't understand why they deserve better treatment. We're all captives together." Ragnar nodded slowly, as if considering the point. Then, in a movement faster than thought, his hand shot out and grabbed Godwin by the throat, lifting the smaller man until his feet barely touched the deck. "You want to know why they are different?" Ragnar's voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried to every corner of the ship. "Because when I offered to take only the boy, he begged me to take his sister instead. When I could have taken both anyway, he offered his willing service to protect her. That is the difference between a slave and someone who might become family." The chieftain released Godwin, who collapsed to the deck gasping. "The boy showed courage and love for family, qualities I value more than gold. The girl has beauty and intelligence that could serve greater purposes than kitchen work. If you cannot understand why these things have value, then you understand nothing about how the world truly works." Edmund felt his face burn with a mixture of embarrassment and confusion. Family. The word seemed impossible coming from the man who had torn them from their home. Yet something in Ragnar's tone suggested the statement was not entirely rhetorical. As if sensing the boy's thoughts, Ragnar turned to face the children. "Come," he commanded. "We need to speak." Edmund helped Gwyneth to her feet, and they followed the chieftain to the prow of the ship, away from the ears of both captives and crew. The wind was stronger here, carrying the scent of distant land and the promise of storms. "In 3 days, we reach my hall in the fjords near Bergen," Ragnar began without preamble. "When we arrive, decisions will be made about every person on this ship. Most will be sold at the slave market or put to work in my fields. Some will be kept as household servants. A very few might earn positions of trust and respect." He paused, studying their faces. "You have the opportunity to choose your own path, but you must understand what each choice means." "What do you mean?" Edmund asked. "I mean that I could give you to my wife's sister, who needs servants for her household. You would be well treated, fed adequately, and live long lives as thralls. It is not a terrible fate. Many born free have lived worse." Ragnar's weathered hands gripped the ship's rail as he continued. "Or you could attempt to earn something more. My own sons are grown and gone to make their fortunes. My daughters are married and living with their husbands' families. My hall feels empty without young voices." Gwyneth looked up at him with wide eyes. "Are you saying you might adopt us?" The word hung in the salt air like a prayer awaiting an answer. Ragnar's expression grew thoughtful, as if he were considering the possibility for the first time, though Edmund suspected the idea had been growing in the chieftain's mind since the moment of their capture. Adoption among the Norse is not the same as among Saxons, Ragnar explained. It is not granted freely, but earned through loyalty, courage, and service. You would have to prove yourselves worthy of such honor. And even then, you would never truly be Norse. You would always carry the mark of your Saxon birth. But we would be free, Edmund pressed. Freedom is earned, boy, not given. Even my own sons had to prove their worth before they were granted full rights as men. You would start as fostered children, with the possibility of earning more if you showed yourselves worthy. The offer was beyond anything Edmund had dared hope for, but he sensed there were complications not yet spoken. What would we have to do? Ragnar's smile was grim. You would have to become Norse, in all but blood. Learn our language perfectly, adopt our customs, honor our gods, or at least show them respect. You would train in weapons and warfare, learn the skills of leadership and trade. Most importantly, you would have to prove your loyalty beyond question. And if we refuse, Gwyneth asked quietly, then you will be well-treated thralls, nothing more and nothing less. A comfortable life, but not a free one. Edmund felt the weight of decision pressing down on him like a physical force. Accept, and they might eventually earn freedom and respect, but at the cost of abandoning everything that made them Saxon. Refuse, and they would be slaves forever but could maintain their cultural identity. How long do we have to decide? He asked. You have until we reach shore, Ragnar replied. But know that this offer will not come again. I'm not a man who gives second chances in matters of such importance. As if to emphasize the gravity of the moment, lightning flickered in the storm clouds that had been following them since morning. The wind picked up, and Ragnar moved away to help his crew prepare for rough weather. Edmund and Gwyneth huddled together as the first drops of rain began to fall. Around them, the ship came alive with activity, as 40 Viking warriors prepared to battle the storm with the same efficiency they brought to raiding and warfare. What do you think we should do? Gwyneth asked her brother. Edmund watched Ragnar shouting orders to his men, noting how they responded with instant obedience born of respect rather than fear. The chieftain moved among them like a conductor directing a complex symphony, anticipating problems before they arose and positioning resources where they would be most effective. I think, Edmund said slowly, that we're seeing something remarkable. This man could have taken what he wanted from us and thrown away the rest. Instead, he's offering us a chance to earn something precious, the opportunity to shape our own destinies. But we would have to stop being Saxon, Gwyneth pointed out. Would we? Or would we become something new, Saxon and Norse together? Edmund's voice grew stronger as his thoughts crystallized. Look around us, Gwyneth. These men aren't monsters. They're fathers and sons and brothers, just like the men of our village. They have their own codes of honor, their own ways of caring for family and protecting what they value. The storm struck with full fury then, turning conversation impossible as waves crashed over the ship's rails and wind howled through the rigging. Edmund pulled his sister closer as they watched Ragnar and his crew battle the elements with skill born of generations of seamanship. In that moment, as he watched the Viking chieftain risk his own safety to secure a loose sail that threatened to tear away, Edmund made his decision. This was a man worthy of respect, perhaps even loyalty. If Ragnar could offer them the chance to rise above their circumstances through their own efforts, then it was an opportunity that demanded serious consideration. The storm raged for 3 hours, testing every timber and rope on the Sea-Wolf. When it finally passed, leaving them under clearing skies with the Norwegian coast visible on the horizon, Edmund knew that more than the weather had changed. As Ragnar approached them again, water still dripping from his beard and his eyes bright with the exhilaration of surviving another battle with the sea, Edmund stood to face him. "We've made our decision," the boy announced, his voice carrying clearly across the now calm deck. Ragnar waited, his expression neutral, but his eyes intent. "We choose to try," Edmund said. "We choose to earn the right to become part of your family, your people. We don't know if we can succeed, but we want the chance to try." Gwyneth stood beside her brother, adding her voice to his. "We choose the harder path because we believe the reward is worth the risk." Ragnar studied them both for a long moment, then slowly nodded. "So be it. When we reach my hall, your real education begins. Remember this moment, children, because from now on, everything you were must merge with everything you might become." As the longship entered the fjord that would lead them to their new life, neither Edmund nor Gwyneth looked back toward the English coast, now disappearing behind them. Their Saxon childhood was ending, but something else, something they couldn't yet name or understand, was about to begin. The sun was setting behind the Norwegian mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that reminded them both of their father's forge back in Whitmore. But this was not an ending. It was the first dawn of their transformation from Saxon captives to something entirely new under the northern stars. 5 years later, the great hall of Ragnar Bloodaxe rang with the sounds of celebration as his extended family and retainers gathered for the feast of Yule. At the high table, 2 figures sat in positions of honor that would have been unthinkable to the frightened Saxon children who had arrived on these shores half a decade earlier. Edmund, now 18 and bearing the Norse name Einar Ragnarsson, had grown tall and broad-shouldered, his dark hair now braided in the Viking fashion, and his arms marked with the intricate tattoos that told the story of his deeds in battle. Beside him, Gwyneth, now called Gunhild, had blossomed into a young woman of striking beauty whose intelligence and diplomatic skills had made her invaluable to Ragnar's household. Both siblings bore the silver arm rings that marked them as valued members of Ragnar's extended family, earned through years of proving their loyalty, courage, and worth. They spoke Norse as fluently as they once spoke Saxon, and their skills in warfare, trade, and leadership had earned them the respect of warriors who had initially viewed them as merely exotic captives. Yet in quiet moments like these, when the fire burned low and the mead made memories more vivid, they sometimes spoke softly to each other in the Saxon tongue of their childhood, remembering a father named Aldrich and a village called Whitmore that seemed like something from another lifetime. They had become Norse in all the ways that mattered, but they had never forgotten who they once were. In that duality, they had found not division but strength, the ability to bridge worlds and understand perspectives that pure-blooded Vikings could never grasp. Ragnar, now graying and bearing the accumulated scars of 50 winters, watched his adopted children with pride mixed with wonder. The gamble he had taken that morning in the English village had paid dividends beyond anything he could have imagined. They had become the children of his heart, if not his blood, and their unique backgrounds had brought perspectives to his court that had proven invaluable in negotiations with both Saxon kingdoms and rival Norse clans. As the celebration continued around them, Einar raised his horn of mead in a toast. "To family," he said in Norse, his voice carrying to every corner of the hall. "Not just those born to us, but those chosen by courage, forged by trial, and sealed by loyalty." The assembled warriors and family members raised their own horns in response, understanding that they were witnessing something remarkable, the completion of a transformation that had begun with a desperate plea on a misty English morning and had culminated in the forging of new identities that honored both past and future. Gunhild smiled at her brother's words, remembering the frightened boy who had once begged a Viking chieftain to take him instead of his sister. That boy still lived within the confident young man beside her, just as the terrified girl she had been still existed within the poised young woman she had become. They had learned that identity was not something fixed and unchanging, but something that could be consciously shaped and deliberately earned. In choosing to embrace their new lives while honoring their old ones, they had become something unique in the Viking world, living bridges between cultures, proof that family could be built on choice and loyalty rather than merely blood and birth. The feast continued deep into the winter night, but the real celebration was quieter and more profound, the acknowledgement that sometimes the greatest treasures are not gold or silver, but the unexpected bonds forged in the crucible of adversity and choice. In becoming Norse, Edmund and Gwyneth had not lost themselves. They had found themselves in ways they never could have imagined in the simple village of their birth. And in the years to come, their unique perspectives would help shape the destiny of the North Sea kingdoms in ways that no pure Saxon or pure Viking could have achieved alone. Their story had begun with a raid and a desperate bargain, but it had become something far greater, a testament to the power of adaptation, the strength found in chosen family, and the truth that sometimes losing everything is the only way to discover who we truly have the potential to become. Don't forget to like this video if you enjoyed this tale of courage, transformation, and the bonds that transcend blood and birth. Subscribe for more epic Viking stories and comment below to share your thoughts about Edmund and Gwyneth's incredible journey from Saxon captives to Norse family members. Where are you watching from? Let us know.